in the whole 6010.
Fantasy Focus Football is presented by Geico. Switch to Geico and see all the ways you could save. It is the final day of August. Field and Mike hanging out with you today, and Liz Loza will be joining us later on in the show to talk about some players in the middle rounds that are just driving us crazy right now. How you doing, man? You good?
I'm good. The graphic said I'm Daniel Dopp today, so I'm just gonna be a cool Lions fan, talk about Hard Knocks, and just be awesome. That's what I'm gonna do.
Hard Knocks was awesome. Last night. Did you watch?
I did not. I was busy. Same. Some of us had to work through a cut day.
Right.
So I was actually, in all seriousness, went through every single one, updated all of our depth charts, the projections on the site, the projections PDF, all of that is good to go. So if you want to check that out, you can go on the site and we're gonna have a big wave of waivers today. So it's gonna change things again, but at least for now, it's updated. So if I kind of zone out, like if you're talking, I'm just like staring over there, not paying attention. That's why I'm like completely burnt out right now.
Well, so on the NBA side here at ESPN, we have a gentleman named Kevin Pelton, who's awesome, and they call him the Machine. You are the machine of NFL coverage here at ESPN. Mike Clay works incredibly hard every single day and still finds time to join us here on this little podcast to talk about a lot of stuff, Mike, including projections. How the sausage is made will be revealed a little bit later on in the show. We're going to begin with some news, and yesterday we got news from Houston that Marlon Mack has been released. Yet another log on the fire of Dameon Pierce's soaring ADP. Yeah,
it's obviously, I want to say good news for him. It just kind of secures his role a little bit, right? Yeah. We kind of knew this was coming. I don't think it changes a lot. My concern is, look, we've spent the whole offseason talking him up as a sleeper, right? Because he was going in the later rounds, the double-digit rounds. And now I'm worried he's going to jump too high. I think he's going to be overdrafted now. And I'm going to lay out a little bit of the reasons why for that. I have him RB30, by the way, right? So I'm not right going
where I am too. Yep.
Yeah. So that's like, a little after Eli Mitchell, Edwards-Helaire, Miles Sanders, Devin Singletary, near like Kareem Hunt, Ramondre Stevenson, Damian Harris, kind of in that area. But I want to lay out a couple numbers here, so bear with me. Just something to think about, some context for day 3 running backs. Okay, let's start with 4th-round running backs since 2001. All of them picked in the 4th round. That's all. It's over 20 years. 4th-round running backs. 0 finished top 12 in fantasy points. 1 finished top 20. 2 finished better than 27th. Dominic Williams, Roy Halou. That's it. So that's 4th-rounders. Now,
throwback names right there.
Now, let's say you want to say, okay, but the era is a little different now, right? Let's go more recent. Let's talk about all day 3 running backs and undrafted running backs. Okay, so since 2013, this is 8 seasons. 1 day 3 running back is finished better than 20th in PPR. Jordan Howard. 1.
Wow.
If we include undrafted players too, 2 out of 88 who played.
Who was the undrafted one?
The undrafted one.
Sorry to put you in the spot.
James
here.
Robinson, Phillip Lindsay.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah.
That's it. Yep. 2 out of 88 undrafted running backs during the last 8 seasons who played a snap were finished top 20. That shows you how extremely rare it is for a player like Pierce to finish as an RB1 or RB2.
Yeah, no, it's extremely rare. And so I think everybody at this point kind of knows like the things that are going in Dameon Pierce's favor, right? Looks like a talented guy, flashed well during the preseason, and will be the first player into the game for the Houston Texans. The mitigating factors are that now he's going in like the 4th, 5th rounds of some drafts ahead of other players that either have way more touchdown upside or way more receiving upside. Because what we don't know about Dameon Pierce is that if it's 3rd down or if it's a 2-minute situation, will it be Dameon Pierce or will it be Rex Burkhead, who's still a useful pass catcher in the NFL, an important part of that Texans backfield? So we all agree we love the talents of Dameon Pierce. I just wonder if like the price has gotten too rich based off of some factors that certainly can mean good things, like playing well in the preseason, but they are not guarantees of how things are going to shake out. This still projects to be a low-scoring offense, a team that could be playing from behind quite frequently. And while Lovie Smith has said we are a running football team, it becomes decidedly more difficult to run if you are down 14 points in a game.
Right, exactly. And the whole point is the price, right? He was a value going in the 12th round. That's when you're like, okay, that's when we're talking him up as a sleeper, right? You want to get this guy because he could outperform that. He could be the lead back. He could, this is a situation where the depth chart's open and he could be a flex option. And who knows, maybe he is an exception and is a breakout. At that point in your draft, great. If he jumps up to the 4th, 5th round, then it's like, okay, like to your point, you're taking him above like good certified wide receiver 3s, like once you're in that range, it's a little much. So all I'm saying is be excited about him. If he's your guy, you want him, go get him. But think about the ceiling, right? There's limitations on what his ceiling is based on league history.
Let's move forward here to the projections. And for those that are unfamiliar, you're probably not by now. But if you are, if you're out there and you're looking at the ESPN app and you're looking at your week 1 matchup because you've already had your draft, or you're just looking at player season-long outlooks, you're saying to yourself, how do they come up with these numbers? Here's the truth. Mike Clay, who works harder than anybody else here at ESPN Fantasy, is the engine that makes all of those numbers happen. I have no idea how we do it, Mike, so I'm going to ask you some questions.
Mostly my daughters.
Most of your daughters?
Yeah, they mostly do.
I mean, I was going to save that until a little bit later on in the show, but yes, Mike is really like the third most important person in his own family as far as ESPN Fantasy is concerned. But let's talk about this, Mike. How, just speaking generally, we can get into, let's not get into too much minutia. Speaking generally, how do you build your projections?
Yeah, so it's funny you say not too much minutia. Like we could talk about this for hours, right?
The whole day.
It's a long process. So again, I'll try to keep this in a nutshell because I do get asked this a lot, but basically over a decade ago, I started building a model and I just keep improving on it. And it has a lot of elements to it. Some of it are quantitative and they go into like projecting a yards per carry, right? Or a catch rate or a completion rate or whatever it may be. And then there are layers that are qualitative, right? And one of the examples of that would be yesterday when guys were being cut and there were reports of who's going to start and all those kind of things moving around. I can't just, remove a guy from the depth chart like a Marlon Mack and just say, all right, I'll just let the model figure out who's getting the carries, right? There's some element of, okay, Dameon Pierce probably picks up maybe 1 or 2 carries a game, or maybe Royce Freeman has a role now, right? What makes sense? Use your experience, your common sense, use reports. All right, we have a great NFL Nation team, which is huge for this kind of stuff, driving that qualitative side of the projection. So it's a combination of everything. These projections, as people who follow me know, are up to date, 11 months a year, something like that, because they have to be. There's always things we're learning. Things are always changing. Free agency, the draft, cut day, in-season, like it's always changing. So again, a lot goes into it. It's an always evolving process, but the idea is to be as close to accurate as we can every day of the year.
And you do a tremendous job. You go back and look at some absolute, like you just smashed. Was it Kyler Murray as a rookie where you literally guessed his rushing yards within like 1 yard?
We remember that one because he was critical of the projection going into the season. I remember him like giving Matthew a hard time. He was like not happy, and it turned out to be right on. So yeah, that was a good one. But yeah, look, I don't want to pat myself on the back too hard because I'll then have a bad year. But people, like outside people, have done research on this. Like, should you just trust the projections when setting your lineup? Should you fade them? What should you do? And it shows that if you just trust the projections every week, you're probably going to be 5 to 10% better in terms of points scored. So that makes me feel good.
Yeah.
And people who use the rankings seem to have success. So
you left out one important part, is that there was also a study of whose projections are the most reliable in the industry. And the answer was Mike Clay's, which is absolutely no surprise to anybody that has worked with Mike for even a day. So let's just dive a tiny bit deeper. You do an incredible job. As you are looking at the various stats that factor into a projection model, are there stats that you find to be most predictive for a player that can be useful in forecasting how you expect him to perform?
Well, mostly for receivers, like if they have breakfast a lot with the quarterback, that's the big one, right? Like
or Instagram posts.
Or Instagram posts,
right.
Yes. Okay, the Cooper Cup factor, right? That's a new metric this year we're working on. So, but seriously, I would say something like average depth of target's a big one, right? You know, for a long time, it was just like yards per catch or yards per target, right? Which I'll talk about in a second. But average depth of target was a huge one, right? When I was at PFF, that was a big stat that they started tracking depth when I was there. And I was able to turn that into ADOT, and that drives, where a player is on the field when they're targeted. So that's why you hear me talk about it a lot. You get a much bigger sample size with usage for players. That is one that drives a lot of our yards per catch and yards per target sort of numbers. So that one's a big one for sure. It's a lot more predictive than other stats. And the other one, of course, there's a reason we say volume is king all the time. Right? We say volume is king all the time. Why? Because that's what matters more than anything else. I don't care if you average 20 yards a catch. If you get one target a game, it doesn't really help you from a fantasy perspective, right? So carries, targets, pass attempts, whatever it may be, those are the biggest driver, and they're more predictive than other stats as well. So if we know the volume, the rest will generally follow.
Do you always, and you said that on average, if you follow the projections, you tend to perform 5 to 10% better than going with your gut. But do you ever defy your own projections? And what, if so, what leads to that situation?
I do. And you might see that too if you compare my rankings just to the projected point totals, right?
Yeah.
And there are various reasons for that. First of all, they are not perfect, believe it or not. So if a guy is within, say, 0.4 points or something like that, you might think about it and stare at it for a while and say, okay, I understand why this projection is the way it is, but I see this guy as having a larger ceiling. What if this game gets out of hand and it is a higher scoring affair and he scores a couple touchdowns? This guy has a chance of doing that. This guy may be a little safer, higher floor, but maybe doesn't have quite that upside. So I might decide, you know what? I'm the underdog this week in my matchup. I'm going to take a shot and go with a more boom-bust player. And that applies, in drafts as well, right? Once you get past you can follow the projections for a few rounds, get the safe players, the guys that are superstars you feel good about. But once you get to the second half of your draft, you're looking for more higher ceiling players that maybe are hard to project for a big stat line because they're buried, but one injury away, they could be, in position to be a must start. Think about an Alex Madison, right? Insurance backs are a great example of that. How do you project Alex Madison as, say, a top 20 back? You can't because Dalvin Cook's there, right? But if Cook's not there, the number would be much higher. So that's a differentiator. Another one would be Chris Olave, right? A lot of mouths to feed in New Orleans, but you cross off Michael Thomas, and suddenly Olave's projection would be significantly higher. So when you're looking in the double-digit rounds, that's why you would take someone like Olave, even though his projection might not be like top 20, top 25.
Yeah, so I am not nearly as scientific with my process as you, but I'll just quickly note that not only do I occasionally define my ranks, but one thing I've tried extremely hard to do this year is get exposure to almost everybody. You play in 10, 12, 13 leagues. You can't necessarily cover every single player, but I have a different quarter. I think I've done like 6 redraft drafts already with a handful more to come. And I have a different quarterback in each of them. And that's by design because as much effort as we all put into this, guess what? We're humans. We're going to mess up on occasion. Mike, less so than most of us. But it's good to have some exposure to players that even if you're not totally optimistic on them, you understand that you may not be entirely on the mark. One of the things that you have told us about for years, and you have been the king of regression here at ESPN, is reminding us that something that happened for better or worse as an outlier is not a given to repeat. But just sort of speaking generally again, for those that have been less familiar with your analysis on regression, explain to people who aren't as familiar sort of what it's all about, the nuts and bolts of it.
In a nutshell, it's players cannot repeat. They cannot sustain extremely high or extremely low production in a variety of categories, right? One of them is touchdowns, right? Players who score an abnormal amount of touchdowns, 14 plus is really the key number for rushers and receivers. Almost never repeat. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, specifics on that. But that's one element of it. It goes on the other end too, right? Guys that have like a Kyle Pitts, for example, who we'll talk about, an extremely low touchdown rate on high volume is going to regress to the mean a little bit. So that applies to touchdowns. It applies to other rate stats. You think about something like yards per attempt for Joe Burrow last season, led the NFL. History shows no one can really. Aaron Rodgers is the only person ever to repeat a super high yards per attempt, at least in the past decade. Joe Burrow's not going to do that. His yards per attempt may drop by a full yard, right? But it's also volume stats too, right? We've talked about this with like Patrick Mahomes. He was the one the whole offseason after his MVP year. No, Mike, he's the exception, right? This guy is a unicorn. He's going to break everything. I watched him play last year. There's no way he's going to repeat these numbers forever. And you're like, no, he's not. He's just not going to do it, right? Like it just does not happen. Even the best players in league history have a little bit of a roller coaster in their stats, right? They peak years for a reason. They don't peak every single year and have the exact same stats. And that's what we've seen. Doesn't mean he's any less of a player. He's a great player. But guys just at this level cannot sustain 32, now 34 consecutive games of that off-the-charts Hall of Fame level production.
Yeah, it makes you appreciate guys like Jerry Rice in his prime, which was like 20 years, by the way. LaDainian Tomlinson, who was so incredible.
A little bit of a different era, too.
Arian Foster, Most recently, Derrick Henry, 55 rushing touchdowns in 55 games. These guys who are just so money in the bank for a prolonged period are the kind of players that can really win you your league, even if you're taking them at the top of your drafts. Let's dive into some of the players, Mike, that might be due for some regression and sort of analyze what level of concern you have for them and what it might mean for their value. And let's discuss the 3 wide receivers that are being drafted in terms of consensus, 1, 2, 3. Usually Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, and Jamar Chase in that order. Kupp had an off-the-charts year last year. Does that mean that he's most vulnerable in this group?
To some extent. I mean, you look at the last player to repeat leading the NFL in receiving yards, Calvin Johnson in 2012, right? That's a decade ago. It doesn't happen very often. And, you look at someone like Calvin Johnson, he's the only other player ever to have 1,900 receiving yards, and the next year he had 1,492. So you see, if you're watching, you see my projection for a Kupp this season is 1,349. That includes a little bit of an injury factor there as well, right? I have him at 16 games, not 17, which is my ceiling for wide receivers. Obviously, there's some injury risk there. Keep in mind, all 3 of them guys projected for fewer targets this season. Jamar Chase is very close. I think his target share in year 2 goes up a little bit. And the reason for that partially, again, is some injury risk, right? All 3 played 17 games last season, which is part of why their numbers were so high. So still love them all. They're my 1, 2, 3, but that's why you're going to see the projected numbers down from last season. And by the way, if you head over to the books and you want to place some bets on some player props, these might still be above those lines, right? Those lines are way more conservative than I am, and I'm conservative.
Jonathan Taylor last year had over 2,000 total yards from scrimmage. He also had 20 touchdowns. Is he due for a major regression this season?
Well, he's still my RB1, so not
that
too much.
Right,
but
yeah,
like I said, players that score 14 plus touchdowns tend to fall off the next season. Here is that number. From 2010 to 2020, of the 46 times a player scored 14 or more touchdowns, 44, that's almost 96%, scored fewer the next season. The average drop in touchdowns, 8.3. Substantial drop in scoring. The only exceptions, Todd Gurley and Marshawn Lynch, believe it or not. So maybe Jonathan Taylor's the exception, but you have to project a drop in touchdowns for sure. I'm at 15 compared to 20. Again, he played in all 17 games too, so you have to bake in a little injury risk as well.
Would you say that your projections are almost the median outcome for the player? Okay, so that's
Absolutely.
worth noting that when you see Jonathan Taylor's projection this year at 315 points, which is 58 fewer than last year, again, that's right in the middle of where things could go for Jonathan Taylor. He could hit 400 fantasy points this year. He also might be at 250, which, by the way, for players not named Jonathan Taylor, is not that terrible of a season. It's about 15 fantasy points per game. 2 running quarterbacks, Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts. I think as long as he stays healthy, Lamar Jackson's the much better bet to sustain his rushing production. But Jalen Hurts, an awesome runner in his own right.
Yeah, and the key for him is goal line work, right? For Jalen Hurts, right? That's a big difference. He's more Cam Newton than he is Lamar Jackson in terms of rushing the football, right? So last year, Hurts was number 1 in carries, rushing yards, rushing touchdowns at quarterback, of course, expected touchdowns, and inside the 5 carries, he had 14 of them. He was also second in scrambles. But check this out. His expected touchdown total, remember, he had 10 rushing touchdowns. His expected total was 11.1, actually higher than that. Lamar Jackson's was 5.3, only had 2 touchdowns. He was a little unlucky, but check this out. Jackson has never been over a 6.8 in terms of expected touchdowns. Hurts was at 11.1 last year, which just shows you how much goal line work he got. And that makes me a little nervous, I guess, about durability, right? He's not quite as big as Cam Newton, right? And he did miss some time last season, so that worries me a little bit. But on a week-to-week basis, there's other than the Detroit matchup, there's a reason Jalen Hurts is our number 1 projected quarterback for week 1. And part of that is, first of all, he's going to score a lot in Detroit, but he's going to get a lot of goal line work. So week to week, we love Jalen Hurts. It's just a matter of how good of a passer is. Does he keep that job for all 17 games? Does he stay healthy? A little more risk than a Lamar Jackson. That's why, to your point, I have Jackson ranked ahead of Jalen Hurts. So.
If Jalen Hurts' rushing touchdown production does come down, one can only hope that means that Miles Sanders actually gets at least one of them. He, of course, had 0 rushing touchdowns last year. Kyle Pitts had 1 receiving touchdown. How about this? Over the past 20 years, there are 2 players in the NFL with at least 1,000 receiving yards and 1 or fewer receiving touchdowns in the same season. Kyle Pitts last year. I'll give you a nickel if you can guess the other one.
Danny Amendola.
Brian Hartline for the 2009 Miami Dolphins. Brian Hartline, who, by the way, that dude is an unreal coach now at Ohio State. He is just crushing it, coaching their wide receivers. But that 1 year was an outlier year until Kyle Pitts joined him in this, I guess, ignominious club. So Kyle Pitts is bound for a better year this year, right?
Yeah, and I won't get too into the stats on this one, but let's just say there's an 80% hit rate on guys who have 50 plus touches year to year and just have, 1, 2, 3 touchdowns, right? And by 80%, I mean 80% of the time they score more. And that's really hard to do in the NFL. Those scoring more categories hit less because of injuries, right? They're obviously going to have a big impact. So there's a good chance he's going to score a lot more touchdowns this season. And speaking of which, there was only, of the guys who scored 1 or 2 touchdowns in a season of 50 touches, and then the next year at 50 touches, there's only 3 examples in the past decade of guys who did not manage to up their total. Do you know who they are? 2 of them are the same guy.
No. Oh, my gosh.
One's Danny Amendola.
Okay, so he did not up his total twice.
And the other, once.
Okay.
And the other one is Jason Avant. Did it twice.
Wow.
He achieved that twice.
Eagle standout.
Yeah.
Huh?
So, he was awesome. He was an awesome player, but he was just allergic to the end zone.
Man, well, I'm not allergic to it. He just didn't like it that much.
Yeah, I guess so.
But the Eagles are pretty good.
I think he was allergic.
Let's dive in. So again, projections available via Mike and regression candidates. I mentioned Miles Sanders, not on our show note, but another example. Cole Kmet, amongst the guys that did not find the end zone last year that are bound to find it again this season. Dalvin Cook kind of saw this last year. After 29 rushing touchdowns in the prior 2 seasons, he had 6 just last season. He'll go back up, at least I would hope. Let's move forward to some cloudy situations, but these are cloudy, I think, with a positive outlook if such a thing is possible.
Sure.
Do you believe that there is going to be a clear-cut Broncos #1 wide receiver this season, or could it be that Jerry Jeudy and Courtland Sutton both finish as like top 20-ish players?
Well, I have Jeudy ranked 22nd, Sutton 23rd.
Okay, so I understand where you're going on this one, huh?
But check this out. I mean, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, both top 10 fantasy receivers the past 2 seasons, right? So, I mean, they both can be great, right? They both can finish, say, 16 and 18, something like that. It's certainly possible. Wilson has done it before. They're both tremendous talents. We've seen Courtland Sutton put together a top 20 fantasy season, and Jerry Jeudy was the 15th overall pick 2 years ago, and maybe has a year 3 jump here, has had some really bad luck in the catch rate and the touchdown department. Speaking of touchdown regression, I mean, 3 on 167 career targets. Those are all numbers we expect to increase this season. So, I don't think you should be drafting them with a wide gap, and Sutton's been going a couple rounds ahead of Jeudy, which I haven't really understood this season, unless you're just not in on Jeudy, which would surprise me. But I think you just draft him close and hope the one you pick is the guy that separates himself.
You know, it's funny. A lot of the drafts that I'm in are with people that either I work with here at ESPN or are in the fantasy industry in some way, shape, or form. And so more often than not, I've actually seen Jeudy going ahead of Courtland Sutton, which is a reminder that just because we're talking about players in a certain way, there could be a pretty significant gap between what we are saying and what the ESPN ADP is. We always talk about it with the quarterbacks, right? Josh Allen's not going 21st in any of my leagues, but he's going 21st on average on ESPN.com. If I had to choose one, and I'll be honest with you, I think I would like to choose both. But if I had to choose one, I have given the slight edge to Courtland Sutton, who cracks the column that I wrote for the first time last year. It's now available on ESPN.com, on ESPN Plus. It's my Field's favorite column. It's not guys that you haven't heard of. It's a bunch of names that you are very familiar with. It's just players that I like based off where they are being drafted this year. And I do think Courtland Sutton's in for a big season this year. How are we splitting the difference between he and Jerry Jeudy? For me, it's a couple things. Very good down the field, maybe more DK. Well, I guess Tyler Lockett was a really good vertical receiver as well, but a little bit more in terms of physical stature, like DK Metcalf. I've used the stat a ton. Led the NFL in air yards per target last season. Has been a productive player with 1,000+ yards already in his NFL career. So we know, I think Jerry Jeudy is going to be awesome, but we know Courtland Sutton can be awesome. And there's just been enough reporting that has suggested, and you talked about how important reporting is in your projections, that the chemistry between Courtland Sutton and Russell Wilson has been perhaps as strong as any 2 players on offense so far this preseason for the Broncos. Let's go to the same division and sort of the same question, although this one, I kind of think I have a little bit less. I think there is a gap here. It's Keenan Allen versus Mike Williams. Which player deserves to be the wide receiver 1 for the Chargers? And I'm not sure it's that much of a debate, but I guess it maybe depends on what you're looking for. So how do you see it?
Yeah, so I guess Williams is going 2 rounds after Allen, right? So we're wondering if that is accurate, if that's what that should be the case right now. And I think the answer is yes, right? I have Keenan Allen as my wide receiver 9.
Yeah.
My only concern with him, frankly, is age, right? He's 30 years old, and there was only, I've used this stat a million times, but there was only one receiver in the top 25 last year was age 29 or older, right?
Yeah.
So you worry about maybe there's a little slip, but then again, possession receivers tend to sustain their production longer, right? So again, I have him wide receiver 9. I'm not too worried about it. Still feel good about Keenan Allen. He's terrific. Mike Williams, very inconsistent. He had a month of dominance to open last season, and then he went right back to kind of where he was previously in his career, which is kind of hit or miss. His target share fell off a little bit, and he kind of deferred to Keenan Allen as their number 1 again. So I have him 18th in my rankings. I'm higher than you by a handful of spots. Actually, it looks like all of our rankers are within 6 spots. So we all kind of agree on him, but I'm a little more optimistic. They paid him a lot. It's a great offense, a high volume pass offense. I think they can support a pair of top 20 receivers.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the year, there's a decent chance that Mike Williams will finish as a top 20 wide receiver. One thing you have been able to count on from him throughout his career is he's going to find the end zone a lot. The question mark is just that if you're using a top 18 or so wide receiver pick on him, and half the time he's going to score less than 10 points, the other half is going to score 15 or more fantasy points, could you get more consistency from guys that are going in that similar range as Mike Williams? That's why I have him a little bit lower. It's just there are some players that I prefer who are going in comparable spots that I think offer a higher weekly floor.
Yeah, that's fair. And you're going to see some inconsistency with, vertical targets, right? But I will say this, consistency probably, I don't want to say,
I know it's low on your metrics that matter. However,
we talked about unpredictable stats, consistency, extremely hard to predict. But again,
this is 5 years of Mike Williams, right? That's the reason why I feel more strong about this than I do other players who maybe just last year were inconsistent. This is the story of his career. He had never had more than 50 catches until last season. And as you noted, even during a breakout year, for the first 5 weeks, he was the best wide receiver in fantasy or close to it. The rest of the way, he had like 8 games with 3 or fewer catches out of his final 11. Like, that's hard to sustain in terms of keeping him in your lineup. He ended up being one of those guys that you started because you had to, not because you wanted to down the stretch last year. The Jaguars have 2 capable running backs, Travis Etienne and also James Robinson. James Robinson, of course, still coming off of that Achilles tear. Do you think this could be Travis Etienne's job from start to finish as their starting running back?
Well, I have kind of mixed feelings on that. I mean, I'm rooting for him. He was a great prospect coming out of Clemson, super productive, comes off the injury. You hope for the best. But James Robinson, great story as well. And he has been terrific so far in his career, averaging about 4.5 yards per carry. We know how good he's been from a fantasy perspective, and he's been effective on the field as well. I just wonder, barring a major leap for this offense, which is possible. I've talked about that with Trevor Lawrence going in year 2, better scheme, better supporting cast. Can they support 2 fantasy relevant running backs? And if not, does that mean James Robinson's just a non-factor? I have a hard time seeing that. And it looks like he's going to be on the field. I think he's going to play a role. I could see him getting double-digit carries every game. I could see him getting goal line work.
Yeah.
And where does that leave Etienne, right? Where does he kind of fall on the spectrum of consistent fantasy output? Does he end up producing like Tony Pollard, right, where he's lacking some ceiling, right? Or does he have enough big games? Or is he more like, say, Aaron Jones, where he gets 40% of the carries and 14% of the targets and scores enough touchdowns to end up in the top 15 or so? So, again, we're talking about projections versus rankings and that kind of thing. And when you project that offense out, it's like, I don't know if there's room for Etienne to pay off his ADP with Robinson in this backfield. That's the struggle I've had with him.
I'm more optimistic, as I have stated several times already so far this preseason. Worth noting that James Robinson, no sure thing to play in week 1. And even if he does play, it certainly feels like James Robinson's role early on in the year could be one that the Jaguars will work to build up over time. Maybe at some point it becomes more of a shared backfield, but it kind of feels like they need Travis Etienne to be the lead guy, maybe a month, maybe longer, maybe a little bit less than that. But I just keep coming back to something that I know is factored in the projections, but can't necessarily be quantified. Is just Travis Etienne has a chance to be a special player. One of the best pass catching running back prospects we've had in quite some time. Just kept finding the end zone at Clemson. And people have said to me previously, like, dude, don't reference college stats when trying to project Travis Etienne. And I'm not saying just because he had great stats, he's a great player. I'm just telling you, trust your eyes, right? Yeah. The guy is an absolute star in an era where first-round running backs are not a guarantee anymore every single year. A lot of people figure that Travis Etienne deserved to be in the first round because of that pass-catching upside. I think this could be one where if the Aaron Jones theory that you just presented comes to fruition, that's median outcome for me. Maybe not.
Yeah. You think Aaron Jones last year was median?
Just the 40% target share. Maybe that's a little bit too rich there. 40% rushing, 40% of the rushing attempts, 15% of the
That's
targets.
about where I have him projected, though.
Okay, that's fine then. Not median. Not median then. That's there's even more is what I would say. There's an even higher ceiling.
And that's fair. And we're only one spot apart, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're actually more in line with where he should be. However, if you go to like a 12-team, competitive best ball leagues, he's going in the third round, right? It's just a little rich for me, right? We did a draft yesterday, our Focus League draft yesterday, and I actually drafted him because he fell much more to where he belongs as opposed to where he's going, in a lot of other 12-team drafts out there. So that's my concern is more where the industry is, less where we are.
I just think again though, but like the pass catching upside is so unique there, right? I worked through it with Kyle based off last year. Like if he averages 5 targets per game, would that stun you?
No.
Because if you average 5 targets per game and have even like a reasonable rushing role, like I'm not talking about 20 carries per game. If you had like 8 to 11 rushes per game and 5 targets per game, like he's bound to be a top 20 running back right away, and more likely a top 12 to top 15 running back. So if that pass catching ability that I am optimistic on comes to fruition, then I think Travis Etienne will be one of the breakout stars in fantasy this year.
All right.
And I love James Robinson. I'm just a little bit nervous about that Achilles. And it's also a new regime. And not that they drafted Travis Etienne, but the talent of Travis Etienne is so undeniable. He's had the entire training camp to prove it. I just really like the player this upcoming season.
I will say this, though, on the new regime point, like Doug Peterson, when they ask about James Robinson, he's like, he's the guy, 3-down back. Like he's saying all the right things for Robinson's camp.
He's been supportive of James Robinson for sure, which I can't tell if that's like just trying to deflect from the fact that he might not be available in week 1, or if he's saying that because maybe he's more committed to James Robinson than I'm giving him credit for right now.
Well, anyway, hopefully it works out.
I'm in on Jacksonville. Into the projections, right? I'm sure that can be.
That's something I think I've been pretty good at, is not overreacting every time you hear something.
Yeah.
You hear a piece of news, you hear a report, you kind of consume it, you think about it, you see if it makes sense, maybe you do a little digging to see if there's anything behind it, and then you decide, I'm going to move the needle a little bit. I'm not going to move it at all. Almost never moving it the opposite direction. But, that's always super important. That's why you generally don't see huge swings, right? Like Romeo Dobbs, like everybody peaks. Like remember when Rashad White was like the big name and everyone was reaching on him? Like our projections didn't change that much for him, right? Like you can't overreact because that's what happens all offseason. Guys go like this and then they always end up right back where they belong anyway. So.
Right. It's like you should update them once on August 1st and then once on August 31st and just collect data in between. We're
not that because everything's always changing a little, but yeah.
Sure. We're going to come back and discuss some strong backfields that have at least 2 good options in just a moment. But first, when it comes to choosing the top running back, wide receiver, quarterback, even which defense is right for your team on any given week, you know where to turn. When you're trying to decide on the right credit card for your wallet, the right mortgage lender for your dream home, or the right savings account, where do you go? The nerds at NerdWallet are here to help you make a smart financial decision. NerdWallet is a personal finance site run by money nerds. Think people as obsessed about personal finance as we are about fantasy sports, who want to share their knowledge with our listeners to help them find the right financial products for them. Let's say you're looking for a new rewards credit card. NerdWallet can help you compare cashback cards side by side so you can feel confident choosing the one that suits your spending. Think of them like your weekly wide receiver PPR rankings, but you're comparing top credit cards that work for you. Ready to make a financial decision? Compare and find top credit cards, savings accounts, and more at nerdwallet.com. NerdWallet, the smartest decision for all your financial decisions. NerdWallet, compare Inc. and MLS 1617539. NerdWallet is not an investment advisor nor an investment broker. Information is for educational purposes only.
So I have some breaking news for once.
Let's hear it.
My pool heater just got installed.
Wow.
Big news.
Wow.
Big news. We're ready for the fall. It's starting to get chilly at night, right? A little bit. So
right.
Big pool update.
Wait,
just got
90 degrees today here in Connecticut. It's not that cold.
Right now, but pretty soon we're going to need it.
Yes, you know the funny part is, like, Connecticut is that, like, we just go from, like, 90 degrees, and then, like, you wake up one morning and it's 42, and I'm like, why am I in flip-flops and shorts right now?
I know. And that happened already, and now it came back. Like, it was getting cold at night, but now it's starting to heat back up, and then it's going to get cold again. So anyway.
Let's talk backfields here. We've got 3 to dive into, 3 that have 2 players each that if they were the only player on the roster would be starters and clear-cut starters for fantasy. Let's go to Denver first here, Mike. And Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams experienced the most 50-50 split that I've ever seen in my time covering the NFL last year. Identical number of carries. Gordon had the edge in terms of rushing touchdowns last year. Javonte Williams had the edge in terms of rush yards per carry. It feels like Melvin Gordon, though, kind of showed the Broncos' hands when he was in front of the microphone maybe 2 or so weeks ago and said, basically, the Broncos want Javonte Williams to be their guy.
Yeah, no doubt. And he's 29 years old, right, is Melvin Gordon. And, you know, I've mentioned this stat before, but you look at the most touches by a running back age 29 or older the last 3 seasons, 205, 203, 235, right?
Yep.
Melvin Gordon had 231 last season. A lot of those guys weren't even competing with a guy like Javonte Williams, and they were still kind of capped at a number lower than where Gordon was last season. So I think his usage will go down, and they'll turn to Javonte Williams for more work this season. And frankly, to be an RB1 field, he doesn't need a huge boost, right? I mean, he was 13th at running back in touches last season.
Right.
And that was with Melvin Gordon in a 50-50 split for almost the entire season, 16 out of 17 games. So no doubt, I'm drafting him wherever I can. I have him ranked as a borderline top 10 option, and I could see him having that huge ceiling. Remember, Jonathan Taylor, weeks 1 through 4 last year, was a situation, not a situational back, but in a shared backfield. He played almost exactly 50% of the snaps in the first month of the season with Naheem Hines and Marlon Mack also involved. And they were like, you know what are we doing here? Yeah. We have a superstar running back who can do it all. They still use Naheem Hines in passing situations sometimes. Marlon Mack disappeared, but Taylor became the guy the rest of the way and dominated that position. I think Williams has at least a chance to do that, but certainly to take on a much larger role than last season, maybe 65%. And if he gets to 65% with Russell Wilson now, this offense is going to score a lot more too.
Score a lot more touchdowns. We saw last year in that 1 week when he was the guy, he finished as RB1 for the week against the Chiefs. And then he broke more tackles on rushing attempts than any other player in the NFL last year, which I mentioned that only because we know he's good. He's really good. Like he potentially could be special. It reminds me in terms of where he was drafted a year ago, in terms of how we're discussing Breece Hall, right? Like super talented guy that he can catch, he can run. The offense should be much better. If he is the clear-cut guy, he'll finish as a top 10 running back this season.
By the way, can I give you I didn't get to use this all offseason, so I'm going to give you an incredible Melvin Gordon stat.
Please.
Right, can I give this to you?
Sure.
He is, Melvin Gordon, one of 11 players in NFL history with 9 total touchdowns in six straight seasons. And one of 11 players in NFL history with 0 touchdowns in a 200-plus touch season back when he was a rookie.
I remember that as a rookie. Yeah.
So he's on the opposite spectrum in both of those touchdown categories. To our point about regressing to the mean, like just unbelievable. That's such an odd stat, but it just shows you how wild touchdowns can get sometimes.
One of my first bold calls when I was doing this podcast in my initial year was like, I thought Melvin Gordon was just going to crush as a rookie. I mean, why wouldn't he? He was the 15th overall pick in a team that needed a back, and he was really great. And he had 0 touchdowns that year. And then the next year, I accused myself from talking about Melvin Gordon.
And he had 8.
And he had 8, and he just kept scoring at least 8 touchdowns like every year since. So maybe I manifested it just in a backwards way for Melvin Gordon, who's a solid player, no doubt about it, has been a really, really good player for a long time.
That was the fantasy football gods kind of humbling you right out of the gate. They're like, he's going to score none now and then score 8+ every year. He's going to be a historical level touchdown scorer after being a historical bad touchdown scorer as a rookie.
Good thing we didn't have Twitter or the internet back then. Oh, wait, we did? Dang. Green Bay has a running back 1A and a running back 1A, Mike, in Aaron Jones and also A.J. Dillon. Does it project that way for fantasy purposes?
Not really. You know, look, I love A.J. Dillon, and I think he's going to have a terrific season, but it's the same problem as I have with Jacksonville, right? Like, how can both of these guys pay off their ADPs right now? That is my concern. You know, I have Jones at 13. I have Dillon at 35. I'm the lowest on him, but their ADPs are 12 and 24. There are 32 teams, and we have 2 guys ranked in the top 24. And by the way, look, I know a lot of times you're going to say, well, okay, they lost Devontae Adams. They're just going to use a lot of 2 running back sets. Teams don't do that, right? The Packers did that 3% of the time last season. 3% of pass plays, they had 2 running backs on the field. That's a total of 20 pass plays. And even if you expect them to increase that, the league average is 8%. A lot of that is fullbacks too. You think about like Kyle Juszczyk, that's counting him too. It's just not something you can really expect them to do when they're throwing the football. It's really not going to happen. And look, Dillon last year, 23rd in fantasy points, but Aaron Jones missed 2 games and he appeared in all 17. He was only on a list of just a handful of running backs that appeared in every game last season. And it doesn't really happen that often. So he had 10 weeks of RB 30 or worse. He was very inconsistent. He had some big games. I get that, especially when Jones was out, but I worry about him paying off this top 25 ADP. I don't think he'll get there if Aaron Jones plays.
Okay, so I do have a good feeling about AJ Dillon this year. I think the way that Aaron Jones pays off his ADP is an increased passing game role, which I know it's been significant in the past, but maybe there's even 10 more targets over the course of the year. And for him, he's likely to catch between 7 or 8 of those, which could be the difference. And I think AJ Dillon pays it off with touchdown equity. With Devontae Adams no longer there, the best goal line receiver in the NFL is gone. The Packers may have to run the football more at the goal line than they have over the past however many years that Devontae Adams has been at his peak. I've got him inside my top 20. I've got him at RB24. Consensus rank is also RB24, which means there are some people that are even more optimistic on AJ Dillon than I am. Should we fancy ourselves a little board bet here, Mike?
Let's do it.
You've got him at 35. I've got him at 24. If we split the difference, that gets us to what, 5.5 each? Is that correct? So 29.5. If he's 29 or better, I win. 30 or worse, you win.
Deal, but this assumes Aaron Jones plays most of the season, right?
Yeah, can we just continue to apply? Number. Yeah, common sense.
Yes, I agree.
Common sense applies to our board bets this year. All right, so I say AJ Dillon finishes a top 29 running back this upcoming season.
I say AJ Dillon finishes outside the top 29 running backs this season.
Put it on the board.
Put it on the board.
We have our drop right there. There you have it. One more in terms of 2 backs. One backfield is Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt for the Cleveland Browns. You are actually lowest on Nick Chubb here, Mike. You have him 16th, so not that far behind. I've got him at 14. So we're talking about really just a couple of spots here in the grand scheme of life. Really, I mean, the floor here for Nick Chubb is so high because you look at his first 4 seasons in the NFL, 1,200 plus rushing yards per season, 9 rushing touchdowns per season. You'll take that every day of the week. The question with Nick Chubb is just, will the passing game volume ever increase? And the answer is unlikely.
Yeah. And look, guys like Nick Chubb, love them as a player. Love Nick Chubb as a player. Hate him as a prognosticator. Because he breaks math, right? He just continues to defy the odds and have these 80-yard touchdown runs and score all these touchdowns, and the volume's not there. The passing game work is not there, and he still managed to produce as a top 12 or top 15 running back. So it is frustrating from that perspective, but it's fun to watch. I mean, he's been super effective. 1st in yards per carry, 3rd in yak since he was drafted. Kareem Hunt is the best yak in the NFL since he was drafted, right? They're both super effective backs. It's hard to project rate stats that high, though. They're extremely hard to sustain, and that's why our projections won't show him with like a 5.5 yards per carry. But you said it, 55% of the carries and 5% of the targets during the 17 games he's played with Kareem Hunt the last 2 seasons. It's just not enough for me to look at that and say this is an RB1, right? Maybe in non-PPR it's close, but in PPR certainly not. So I have not drafted Nick Chubb at all this season, and I feel perfectly fine with that in PPR formats.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I love the player immensely. He is you said the 3rd highest yards per carry since entering the league. Is that what you said?
Yeah. No, 1st in yards per carry, 3rd in yards after contact.
Yeah, he's 3rd in yards per carry in NFL history amongst running backs. You can throw away quarterbacks, too, obviously. Jim Brown.
Is it?
And then Jamal Charles.
I guess it depends where you draw the line, right?
That's true, right.
Like Raheem Mostert and Rashad Penny and Raheem Mostert and Rashad Penny, I think, are one.
So, again, sample size is a bit of an issue in that stat. But Nick Chubb has played long enough where I consider his sample size
agreed.
I'm just having to account for it. Yeah, for sure. All right, and Kareem Hunt, player that we like. I talked about it a couple days ago with Daniel. He's a slightly more optimistic than I am, but as we have seen, like Kareem Hunt's paid off when he has been on the field with Nick Chubb. They have played 29 games together. He's been a top 25 back 15 times. So he's better than a coin flip to wind up being a top 15 back, even when Nick Chubb is playing.
Yeah, RB 11 in 6 full games with Chubb last year, RB 13 in 11 games in 2020 with Nick Chubb. So again, defies logic. Doesn't have the touches to allow that sort of production, but it continues to happen. So it's something you have to at least think about when he's on the board and you're on the clock.
We are going to bring Liz Loza to join us, talk about some mid-round madness. These players in the middle rounds that you just can't quite size up. We'll do that after a quick word first from Mike.
Fantasy football season is around the corner, and that means more of what you love. The teams, the rivalries, the stats, trash-talking friends like field. This season, you know your favorite players are hydrating with Body Armor Sports Drink on and off the field. Your favorite fantasy stars like Kyler Murray, Christian McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb, they all rely on Body Armor to get them to the next level and perform at their best and to give you the trash-talking points you need. Made with potassium-packed electrolytes, antioxidants, no artificial sweeteners, flavors, or dyes, and coconut water. It's a great time to grab some Body Armor Sports Drink for yourself. Body Armor is a great option whether you're playing ball with friends, hauling coolers to a tailgate, or rooting for your team. Body Armor Sports Drink, more than a sports drink. By the way, now through November 1st, buy any one Body Armor product at your local convenience store and scan the QR code in store to enter to be one of hundreds of winners to receive $100 in DraftKings prizing. No purchase necessary, void where prohibited, open to residents of U.S. 21 and older.
Great lad read by Mike. Hey, Geico asks, how would you love a chance to save some money on insurance? Of course you would. After all, who doesn't love a great deal, right? And when it comes to rates on insurance for all things in your life, Geico can help, like with insurance for your car, truck, motorcycle, boat, and RV. Can even help with homeowners, condos, or renters coverage. You could save even more with the special discount when you bundle your coverages. Plus, add the easy-to-use Geico mobile app, available 24-hour roadside assistance, and more. And choosing to switch to Geico becomes an easy choice. Switch today and see all the ways you could save with great rates and discounts. It's easy. Simply go to geico.com to get a rate quote or contact your local agent and get started seeing how much you could save.
Boom.
B+. We are back, and if you are watching our live stream right now, you are a very happy consumer because you see Liz Loza on the screen. Good morning, Liz.
Morning being the operative part of that little phrase. How you doing?
Oh, we're doing great. And not only is Liz in LA, which is 3 hours, it's obviously different time code. Time code's
zone.
not the word I was thinking of. Different time zone. She's on the West Coast. The show was an hour earlier today. Hopefully our live streamers that watch it daily caught that PSA. But Liz, it's time for Mid-Round Madness with Liz Loza, which is brought to you by Geico. Switch to Geico today and see all the ways you could save. And Liz, quarterbacks, I really feel like there's incredible value right now with quarterbacks in those middle rounds. And one of the names that comes to mind is the back-to-back NFL MVP, the player that I drafted as my quarterback in our Focus League yesterday draft, and that's Aaron Rodgers, who last year was quarterback 6, but no longer has Davante Adams. What's your outlook on A-Rod this year?
Well, first of all, I think that these three quarterbacks we're going to discuss could be a topic for a podcast unto itself, right? Like why they're falling. Each of them comes with a really interesting narrative, and I think that that's affecting their ADP. You mentioned, obviously, Aaron Rodgers, back-to-back MVP, but this is the big asterisk, which is causing him to fall. No Davante Adams. So can he do that without his number one? Last year, well, actually in 2020, I want to mention, we saw him be a top 10 quarterback in the 2 games without Davante Adams. Asterisk to that, though, those were the 2 games that Robert Tonyan, who's coming off of an ACL injury and whose week 1 status is still murky, went absolutely ham. We know that Aaron Rodgers is a circle of trust guy. He has been open about having trust issues with this new crop of rookies. I am not as high on him. He's my quarterback 10 overall. I think that's about in between where you and Mike have him. I think ultimately this is like, do you believe it? Do you, the drafter, believe that Aaron Rodgers can three-peat on his MVP status enough to feel comfortable drafting him inside the top 12?
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I drafted him yesterday, so it's not like I'm totally out on Aaron Rodgers. It's just that there are other players that I have found as preferred targets. no Devontae Adams means this passing offense is likely to take a step back, even if it's a small one. Mike, I want to ask you next to start on Russell Wilson, who is a quarterback that I am targeting in those mid rounds because A, he had been a top 10 quarterback for 8 straight seasons, and B, he goes from a great wide receiver duo to a great wide receiver duo.
Yeah, and it's funny because you can almost put Aaron Rodgers in the category of guys who just always get it done, right? I mean, Aaron Rodgers has been a top 9 fantasy quarterback 13 of the past 14 seasons. Russell Wilson has been top 10 8 years in a row prior to last season with the injury time he missed, right? So these guys just always get it done. They're really good veteran quarterbacks. I would say the supporting cast in terms of pass catchers probably a little better for Wilson, but the offensive line in Green Bay, assuming the tackles are healthy, are going to be great. So look, I like both guys. I have them 9th and 10th. They're both fine QB1 options, and Wilson specifically, very aggressive and has the targets to throw to with Sutton and Judy, who we talked about earlier in the show, and even KJ Hamler coming back from injury, and Javonte, on and on. So look,
add some rushing upside as well.
A little bit of rushing that dropped off last season. It's at least a possibility. But look, I think they're both fine QB1 options. I've talked about this over and over. I think there's 12 guys you can feel confident going into week 1 with, and these are 2 of those guys.
Last thing I'll say on Wilson is that I try to stop short of using narratives too often, but I think there is something to prove here for Russell Wilson, who I know all quarterbacks are motivated, but he wants to prove that this trade to Denver is a Super Bowl winning move. I'm just telling you, everything I hear is that he's wired just a little bit differently than your average quarterback, and I mean that in a good way. Liz, we discussed Joe Burrow yesterday. Mike didn't join us. He just joined from the pool for 10 seconds to say that we're overrating him. Where do you fall on Joe Cool?
Well, I love that that's also interesting. I am going to lean towards drafting Russell Wilson just 1 spot ahead of Joe Burrow. I have Burrow at 8 and Wilson at 7. Part of that is because of the narrative you touched upon. Part of that is I'm not quite sure that you can capture lightning in a bottle twice. We haven't seen, listen, all 3 of these quarterbacks are very close. We're nitpicking as to where they're going to go. You would say talent is the tiebreaker. Well, Aaron Rodgers has showed us over the most consistent period and longest period of time that he's the, quote, most talented. He's done it the longest. And yet he's still behind these guys. Burrow I have in the middle of them because it's really fun to root for him. And sure, regression, we know it's going to happen, except he did get it done last year with a subpar offensive line. They obviously, this is the talk all summer, right, have made adjustments to that offensive line, and he has the weapon. So if we talk about Russell Wilson having the pass catchers at his avail, and we talk about Aaron Rodgers just being built a little bit differently, having the talent to do it, then Joe Burrow has both of those things, but he's young, so I'm going to put him in the middle.
Liz, some are saying that the offensive line is no longer offensive. That was right from Mike Clay. He told me to say that. What?
That
was okay.
Great dad
I've
joke.
certainly had better. Thanks. I'm only 7.5 months into this, so I'm still working on my skill set here. Let's move to running backs. And another player that was recently discussed was Cordarrelle Patterson. I'll let Liz step in here first because what a revelation he was last year in an incredible breakout year for the Atlanta Falcons, perhaps by necessity, but Cordarrelle Patterson is now being overlooked in my estimation going into the year. Such a good pass catcher. Where do you rest on this one?
Well, it's interesting. I just said that the reason people are maybe a little iffy on Burrow is because you can't repeat miracles 2 years in a row. But we're giving him the benefit of the doubt because of his age, right? We're using that against Cordarrelle Patterson because of his age at 31 years old. It's just so random and anomalistic to see a player over 30 years old break out the way he did. He actually averaged, after he took over the primary rushing duties from Mike Davis last season, a little over 10 carries and 2.5 catches per week. I do think he's still, with Russell Gage's absence affecting part of this receiving core, going to see a good number of targets. He's still going to, I think, produce good, running back 3 value at this point. I'm not expecting him to be obviously the waiver wire hero that he was last year, but at this point, his ADP has been so overlooked that I don't mind grabbing him as a bench stash.
Yeah, and I think the hidden trick here for Cordarrelle Patterson that he could potentially play is that if they no longer utilize him as a running back and make him a full-time wide receiver, he could prove to be a very, very useful value. Mike, Chase Edmonds seems to be the lead back in the Miami Dolphins backfield. The question, though, is how much of a lead does he have over Raheem Mostert, and how much does that lead matter? Where do you settle on this one?
Yeah, so I think his carries will be capped a little bit, right? He's never had more than 116 in a season. I have him at 133, so I actually have him hitting a career high in this offense. He did run it a lot early last season, but that kind of dropped off, right? He didn't necessarily hold up. He missed some time, and James Conner took on a bigger role down the stretch. So I have Mostert 9 carries ahead. I think he'll still be have a slight edge in the carry department. You have Myles Gaskin, who could be mixed in, who beat out Sony Michel for a roster spot. Keep in mind, if you missed it, Sony Michel was cut yesterday on cut day. He's out of the mix here, but I don't think it affects Edmonds much, right? I think his carry share is capped at about where I had it, maybe a slight increase, and he's going to play a big role in passing situations. Frankly, his projection, not going to look too much different than Cordell Patterson. And honestly, he might end up being like a cheaper version of Travis Etienne, who we talked about, right? They could have a similar carry number analog, and both have huge receiving numbers this season. So again, he's 31st on my board. He's been a little bit undervalued all offseason, but he's a fine mid-round running back target, especially if you wait there.
RB27, so a little bit more optimistic. Really good in the passing game, as you just referenced. Liz, last year, Dameon Harris just kept scoring touchdowns. Last segment, or at least a couple segments ago, Mike told us about regression. Is Dameon Harris bound to regress? And if so, how much does that matter? And how much does it impact his outlook?
So he is bound to regress. I do think there is an overcorrection because of that word. I don't believe that Harris is going to reach double-digit touchdowns this season. He had 14, I believe, 14 or 15 last season. I think he's probably going to flirt with 8 to 9. I also think, heading into last year, I really liked Harris as one of those targets in the running back dead zone that we like to call it. And everybody was like, oh no, but Bill Belichick hates your fantasy team. You never draft a running back from the Patriots. But you had to think about the options at their avail. The options are a little bit different this season. Ramondre Stevenson is getting back. Remember, this is a guy that was comped to LeGarrette Blount from the coaching staff at the top of last summer. Now, he definitely had some growing pains along the way. But I do think there's going to be a bit of a timeshare. Harris has never been hailed as, he's been a kind of a jack of all trades, a master of none. He's a totally fine running back, but I think that Ramondre is going to see some love. And if Ty Montgomery continues to get banged up, he's 29 years old. Some of the receiving that we thought would go to Montgomery is probably going to lean Ramondre Stevenson's way. So the upside, they're both being drafted around the same place. The upside goes with Stevenson, but I do think that people are overcorrecting on Dameon Harris because of the quote regression.
I agree with that. I think the hate has gone too far, as it were, right? On Harris, I found myself drafting him. I drafted him in our marathon draft. He's just falling too far now. He's still a guy that was top 3 in goal line carries last season, and the volume might not be huge, but at the point he's going in drafts now, if he scores 10, 12 touchdowns, he's going to pay that off. And they are, by the way, they're trying to work him into the passing game a little bit. So if it is just him and Stevenson out there, he's probably going to catch more passes than we think.
Yeah, if he was going as RB18, it's a different conversation.
Exactly.
But as RB32, obviously a very, very strong potential value. Liz, Drake London for the Falcons hasn't played in a while. He's been banged up with a knee injury, but indications are it's not that serious. How optimistic are you that Drake London can be this year's rookie wide receiver darling?
I'm not. I know I hate that you started with London for me because I know that everybody on the squad loves him. I am worried about the durability. I do think he has a Mike Evans-esque career in his future. I don't think it's with this offense or these mishmash of quarterbacks because obviously Desmond Ridder is who we're expecting to see the field for at least the back half, right? I think he's going to have some blow-up games. I think all 3 of the wide receivers in this area, in fact, the problem and why they're so, frankly, cheap is because the consistency is going to be really impossible. Drake London will have a blow-up game. He will have a multi-touchdown game, and then he will probably not do anything for 4 weeks. I have him as my wide receiver 40. That is below both of you.
Yeah, I'm more optimistic, it would seem. I just think the target share seems so obvious, right? I mean, the team's wide receiver group, besides Drake London, is a lot of players that most are unfamiliar with. Mike, let's move to a player, though, that is near and dear to your heart. It's Devontae Smith, the prodigy prospect out of Alabama, who's now a sophomore in the NFL. Can this be a make-the-leap year for him?
I think it's going to be hard to do that in this offense with A.J. Brown coming in. If Brown was not there, I'd be a little more optimistic that he makes a year or two leap. But how does the volume go up substantially from, a 20 40-ish percent target share, with A.J. Brown soaking up 20 to 25% of it. And Dallas Goedert there, of course. So I have a hard time moving him up. He's 38th on my board. This is a guy that, kind of all eyes were on Chase and Waddle last year, but he was really good. It's just his role was unique. It was a very run-heavy offense, and he was a vertical target. So to Liz's point, kind of inconsistent, right? But he did play at a high level. I think he's going to be a really good player. It might be a while, though, before that's unlocked, and he's unlocked into like a wide receiver 2, or maybe even someday a wide receiver 1. The only way I think that changes is if this has that kind of, I think Damian Woody actually made this comp on during the marathon. If it's like that year 3 Josh Allen leap where Buffalo, he started passing better and Buffalo switched to a pass heavy offense, you never know. In Philly,
I'd be surprised, wouldn't you?
I would be surprised, but if there's even an element of that, like not perhaps that good, but if there's more of that, like more balanced, lean toward the pass, he throws the ball a lot better. Maybe that unlocks more of these pass catchers. But again, for now, I'm drafting him more as a flex.
Liz, let's wrap up the show here with Tyler Lockett, who is sort of an enigma this year because of the quarterback uncertainty in Seattle. It's going to be Geno Smith, who has played well this preseason, but still a downgrade from Russell Wilson. How much does that impact Tyler Lockett's value to you?
Well, Lockett, and admittedly, this is a sample size issue, but averaged 7.5 targets per game with Geno Smith as the starter last season. He saw more opportunities overall than DK Metcalf with Geno Smith. Also, we didn't really talk about this a whole lot, but DK Metcalf spent most of the summer and offseason purposely, pointedly rehabbing away from the team, dealing with the foot injury. Tyler Lockett hasn't been there. He's been digging in. I think I have him the highest of this group, again, because he is the technician. He is the most proven. He has the highest floor, even if the quarterbacks, neither of them have a have a basement level floor. I also think it's worth noting that he saw a career number of outside snaps under Shane Waldron, who was the new offensive coordinator coming from Los Angeles last year. So there is some idea that there could be growth regardless of the quarterback. And I will say, if Geno Smith, who's been named the starter, that's official now, is a quarterback who doesn't really like making mistakes, Tyler Lockett is the receiver to be at the other end of that.
Okay, interesting there. I think these guys are both so talented, that much is for sure. And I do wonder if the hate has gone too far, to borrow a phrase that Mike used earlier on. We'll just see. Geno Smith being solid in the preseason, we'll see what it means over the course of his career. He has not had many boom games, but perhaps being in a rhythm and being a full-time starter changes that for Geno Smith. If you want to find her, you can go to Liz Loza _FF on Twitter. Did I do that right or no?
You did it perfectly.
Yes, finally I nailed it. Liz Loza is the best. Thank you so much for getting up early and joining us here on Fantasy Focus. We'll talk to you soon, Liz.
Bye, Liz.
All righty, and for Mike Clay, I am Field. We are going to come back tomorrow. You know why? Because we're here every single day, Monday through Friday. I believe we're back at our normal streaming time of 11 a.m. Eastern time. That is confirmed. We're going to talk about some strategy, whether it's 2 quarterbacks or salary cap leagues, the drafts that aren't just your standard 10-team PPR. We'll dive into that and plenty of news because a busy day is ahead of us in the NFL. For Mike, I'm Field. We'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Do you think he'll get claimed off of waivers or no?
No, I don't know. Not yet, right? What time is it? You're the news guy.
Noon.
So noon is
Eastern,
it?
yeah.
Oh, good.
That's when teams have to submit.
I have like 1,000 things to do today, but that waiver wire is going to be top of the list.
Yes!